The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dense Northern California forest. It was September 14th, 2020, and the night had fallen thick and heavy, wrapping the world in a suffocating darkness. The only light came from the flickering headlights of the bus, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the trees. As I drove, the silence pressed in, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, just beyond the reach of the headlights. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A shadowy figure, standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the dim glow. I slowed down, peering through the windshield, but when I reached the spot, there was nothing there. The road was empty, the trees silent. I told myself it was just my imagination, a product of too many long nights and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The air was thick with tension, and my heart raced with an inexplicable fear. As the night wore on, the figure appeared again and again, always just out of reach. Each time, I slowed the bus, straining to see through the darkness, but each time, the figure vanished before I could get a good look. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. The tension was building, a knot of dread tightening in my chest. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something sitting in the empty seats behind me. But the bus remained empty, save for me and my growing fear. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows closing in around me. I could feel the presence more strongly now, a cold, oppressive weight pressing down on me. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, to leave the forest behind and never look back. But I couldn't. I was trapped, caught in a nightmare with no escape. The figure appeared one last time, directly in front of the bus, and I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The bus skidded to a stop, the headlights illuminating an empty road. The figure was gone, leaving only the cold, creeping fear that something terrible was about to happen. The bus was eerily still as I sat there, hands trembling on the wheel. The headlights illuminated nothing but the empty road ahead, and yet the feeling of being watched intensified. I tried to shake it off, forcing myself to breathe slowly, but the fear clung to me like a shadow. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past midnight. The radio had been silent all night, but now it crackled with static, sending a shiver down my spine. Then, through the hiss and crackle, I heard it. A voice, low and distorted, whispering my name. Tom. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the radio in disbelief, my mind racing. It was impossible, yet there it was, clear as day. The voice repeated my name, this time louder, more insistent. I reached out with a shaky hand and turned the dial, but the voice didn't stop. It seemed to echo inside the bus, bouncing off the empty seats and filling the air with a sense of dread. The shadows outside the windows seemed to grow thicker, darker, as if they were closing in on me. I could feel a cold presence creeping into the bus, wrapping around me like icy fingers. I tried to start the bus again, desperate to get out of there, but the engine sputtered and died. The headlights dimmed, flickering weakly before plunging the bus into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The voice on the radio grew louder, more urgent, but the words were garbled, twisted into something I couldn't understand. The only clear sound was the thudding of my heart, loud and frantic in the stillness. Suddenly, the figure appeared again, this time inside the bus. It stood at the back, a dark silhouette against the dim glow of the emergency lights. My throat tightened, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me with eyes I couldn't see, but felt deep in my soul. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away, unable to move. The cold presence grew stronger, suffocating me with its weight, and I knew I had to do something, anything to get away. But the bus wouldn't start, and the figure wouldn't leave. I was trapped, alone in the darkness, with no way out. The darkness inside the bus felt almost tangible, like a thick, suffocating fog that swallowed everything in its path. My mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare. The figure at the back of the bus remained motionless, its presence a constant weight on my chest. I could barely breathe, every breath shallow and labored. The air around me seemed to vibrate with an unnatural cold seeping into my bones. The radio continued its maddening crackle, the distorted voice now a faint whisper looping endlessly through the static. I reached for my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen flickered and went black, just like the bus. Desperation clawed at me as I tried to think clearly. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my face, even in the freezing cold. The figure hadn't moved, but I could sense its gaze on me, piercing through the darkness, watching every move I made. I knew I had to get out of the bus, but stepping into the unknown outside felt just as terrifying. With a deep breath, I forced myself to focus on the ignition, trying once more to start the bus. This time, the engine roared to life, sputtering at first, then catching fully. The headlights flickered back on, cutting through the darkness, but the relief was short-lived. The figure was still there, standing in the same spot, unmoved by the sudden burst of light. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get out of the forest, no matter what. I shifted the bus into gear, my hands slick with sweat, and pressed the accelerator. The bus lurched forward, and I kept my eyes on the road ahead, refusing to look back. But in the corner of my eye, I could see the figure still standing, unmoved. The road ahead seemed endless, the trees blurring together as I sped through the forest. The cold presence that had suffocated me began to fade, but the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of my mind. As I drove, the radio suddenly changed. The static was gone, replaced by a familiar melody. It was an old song, one my mother used to sing to me when I was a child. The sound of it brought a strange sense of comfort, like a warm blanket wrapping around me, pushing the fear away. The figure was gone, and the oppressive darkness lifted. The bus seemed to come back to life, the headlights steady, the engine smooth. I drove faster, desperate to leave the forest behind, the song guiding me through the night. The familiar melody filled the bus, wrapping me in a sense of calm I hadn't felt all night. The road ahead was clearer now, the thick trees gradually giving way to open space. The fear that had gripped me so tightly began to loosen its hold, and I could finally breathe easier. The figure was gone. As I drove, the song continued to play, each note bringing me closer to a sense of peace. I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind me. The forest finally gave way to the outskirts of town. The comforting glow of streetlights replaced the menacing shadows, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The bus hummed steadily beneath me. The engines purr, a reassuring sound in the quiet night. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, expecting to see only the empty seats. But then, something caught my eye. A small object lying on the seat directly behind me. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized it immediately. It was a locket, old and tarnished, with a simple chain. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly. This was the same locket my mother used to wear, the one she always kept close to her heart. I hadn't seen it since she passed away years ago, and now, here it was, in the middle of an empty bus on a lonely road. I held it tightly, a flood of emotions washing over me. Grief, love, and a strange sense of gratitude. Somehow, I knew she'd been with me tonight, guiding me through the darkness. As I pulled into the bus station, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. I parked the bus and sat there for a moment, the locket warm in my hand. The fear of the night seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I knew I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew I wasn't alone. My mother's spirit had protected me, and I could feel her presence lingering, even as the night gave way to a new day. As I pulled into the bus station, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange. I parked the bus and sat there for a moment, the locket warm in my hand. The fear and tension of the night seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I knew I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew I wasn't alone. My mother's spirit had protected me, and I could feel her presence lingering, even as the night gave way to a new day. I stepped off the bus, the locket still clutched in my hand, and walked into the station. The world outside was coming to life again, the darkness retreating into the corners where it belonged. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a lightness in my heart, as if a great burden had been lifted. I knew the memories of that night would stay with me, but they no longer held the same power over me. I was free, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace. The fog clung to the Appalachian Mountains like a thick, suffocating blanket as I began my night shift on October 23rd, 2021. The winding roads were treacherous, barely visible under the dense mist that seemed to swallow everything in its path. I picked up my first passengers from a lonely bus stop, 3 of them, standing silently in the dim light. They boarded without a word, their faces hidden by the swirling fog. As I pulled away from the stop, a sense of unease settled over me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The road twisted and turned through the mountains, and the fog only grew thicker. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of my passengers, but all I could see were faint outlines, blurred by the mist. Their silence was unsettling, and I found myself wishing for even the slightest bit of noise, something to break the oppressive quiet. But the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the tires crunching over the gravel road. I tried to focus on driving, but the silence weighed heavily on me, filling the bus with an eerie tension. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the fog seemed to seep into the bus itself, making everything hazy and distorted. The figures in the back began to fade, their outlines growing fainter with each passing mile. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but when I looked again, they were barely visible. My heart skipped a beat as a cold chill ran down my spine. I wanted to pull over, to check on them, but the road was narrow, with steep drop-offs on either side. I had no choice but to keep going, hoping the fog would clear soon. By the time I reached a small clearing, the figures had all but disappeared. I slowed the bus to a stop and turned around in my seat, my heart pounding in my chest. The seats behind me were empty, completely empty. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to check the entire bus, but there was no sign of the passengers anywhere. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and impenetrable, as if it were alive, trying to swallow the bus whole. I was alone, utterly and completely alone, with no explanation for what had just happened. The bus sat idling in the thick fog, the engine's hum the only sound in the oppressive silence. I couldn't believe my eyes. One moment, the passengers were there, and the next, they were gone, without a trace. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The mist outside seemed to pulse, pressing against the windows, and I could feel the cold seeping into the bus, chilling me to the bone. I kept glancing at the empty seats, half expecting the passengers to reappear, but the bus remained eerily vacant. I knew I had to keep moving, but the fear gnawed at me, making it hard to think clearly. I shifted the bus into gear, my heart pounding as I continued up the mountain road. The fog was thicker than ever, obscuring everything beyond the windshield. As I drove, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, hoping to see the passengers again, but all I saw was the swirling mist. The bus felt like a ghost ship drifting through an endless sea of fog, with only the sound of the engine and my own ragged breathing to keep me company. The road seemed to stretch on forever, a winding path through the desolate mountains. I tried to stay focused, but the memory of those disappearing passengers haunted me, filling me with a deep, unsettling dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that I was being watched by unseen eyes. My thoughts spiraled, and I found myself questioning everything. Had they ever been there at all? Or was I losing my grip on reality, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from? Just as the tension became unbearable, the radio crackled to life, startling me. The static was harsh, grating on my nerves, but underneath it, I could hear something. Faint, distant voices calling out my name. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't just any voices. They were the voices of the vanished passengers. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, as the voices grew louder, more insistent, filling the bus with an eerie, otherworldly sound. My fear deepened, and I felt more alone than ever, trapped in a fog that seemed to have no end. The voices on the radio grew louder, overlapping and echoing in a dissonant chorus that sent shivers down my spine. My name, repeated over and over, filled the bus with a haunting, almost desperate urgency. I wanted to shut it off, to silence the voices that shouldn't be there, but my hand froze just inches from the dial. Something about their tone held me in place. There was fear in those voices, a pleading that cut through the static and wrapped around my heart. They needed help, but how could I help them when I didn't even know where they were? I forced myself to keep driving, though my mind raced with questions and fears I couldn't answer. The road twisted and turned, the fog thickening with each mile, and I began to wonder if I was even on the right path anymore. The headlights barely cut through the mist, and everything outside the bus seemed to blur together into a formless gray. I felt like I was drifting, lost in a world that had slipped beyond my control. The voices on the radio persisted, now softer, almost whispering, but they never faded completely. They were with me, like ghosts, haunting the space just beyond my reach. The air inside the bus grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging up the windshield. My heart pounded in my chest, a relentless rhythm that matched the growing sense of dread in my gut. I knew I had to stop, to figure out what was happening. But the thought of stepping out into that fog-filled night terrified me. I felt trapped, caught between the unknown outside and the impossible inside. The bus itself seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the vibrations from the engine unsettling in their irregularity. I was alone, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one in the bus. Finally, I reached a small clearing, a place where the road straightened out and the fog seemed to pull back just slightly. I took a deep breath and stopped the bus, my hands still shaking. The radio went silent, the voices disappearing as suddenly as they had come. I sat there, staring out into the fog, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the night remained still, unnervingly quiet, as if holding its breath. The passengers were gone, their voices silenced, leaving only the oppressive weight of the mystery they had left behind. I sat in the clearing, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. The fog still clung to the edges of the road, but here it seemed to hover just out of reach, as if it were watching me. My heart raced, the stillness inside the bus more unsettling than the voices had been. The seats behind me remained empty, but the memory of the passengers lingered, their presence palpable in the cold night air. I knew I should get out and check the bus again, but fear rooted me to my seat, every nerve in my body on edge. Finally, I gathered the courage to step out of the bus. The night was deathly quiet, the fog swirling around my feet as I walked along the side of the vehicle. I checked every door, every window, but there was no sign of the passengers. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air, leaving me alone in this strange, silent world. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, hidden just beyond the reach of the fog. I climbed back into the bus, my heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. As I sat down, I noticed something strange on the dashboard. A single bus ticket, old and faded, with the date October 23rd, 1971, printed on it. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the ticket, the implications settling over me like a dark cloud. This couldn't be possible. The passengers I had picked up tonight couldn't have been real, at least not in the way I had thought. The bus ticket was a relic from decades ago, and yet it was here in my bus, as if it had always been there. I drove the rest of the way down the mountain in a daze, the ticket clutched tightly in my hand. The fog gradually thinned as I descended, the trees giving way to the familiar lights of the town below. But the sense of unease never left me, the mystery of the vanished passengers weighing heavily on my mind. When I finally reached the bus depot, I parked the bus and stepped out, the cold night air biting at my skin. As I looked back at the bus, I saw it, just for a moment, a shadowy figure reflected in the window, before it faded into the darkness. I stood there, frozen, the old bus ticket crumpled in my hand, knowing that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. August 5th, 2024 was supposed to be just another routine drive, but from the moment I picked up the campers, something felt off. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. As I guided the bus through the winding roads of the Rockies, the only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of the trees. The campers were silent, their excitement from earlier in the evening now dampened by the eerie atmosphere that had settled over us. The road to the campsite was narrow, with dense woods on either side, the darkness so complete that even the bus headlights seemed to struggle to cut through it. As we approached the final stretch, I noticed a strange light flickering through the trees, off to the right. It was faint at first, just a small glimmer in the distance, but as we got closer, it grew brighter, almost like a campfire. I slowed the bus, squinting through the windshield, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the campers were all accounted for. No one should have been out there. A cold chill ran down my spine as the light seemed to follow us, flickering in and out of the trees as we continued down the road. The campers had noticed it too, their uneasy whispers filling the bus. I tried to reassure them, saying it was probably just a reflection, maybe someone else camping nearby. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. There was no other campsite for miles, and the light was too close, too deliberate in the way it moved, almost as if it were tracking us. As we finally reached the campsite and the campers began to disembark, I couldn't shake the feeling that the light was still there, watching us from the shadows. The campers set up their tents, their laughter and chatter breaking the tension that had hung over the ride. But I couldn't bring myself to relax. I decided to stay near the bus for a while longer, my eyes constantly darting back to the spot where I had seen the light. It had disappeared now, but the sense of unease lingered, a knot of fear tightening in my chest. Something was out there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me. After dropping off the campers and watching them settle in, I found myself drawn back to the spot where I had seen the light. The night had grown colder, the air thick with an unsettling quiet that seemed to amplify every sound. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight from the bus, I set off down the narrow trail that led into the woods, the beam of light cutting through the darkness ahead. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches forming an almost impenetrable barrier. The light reappeared, flickering faintly through the trees, guiding me deeper into the forest. It wasn't the warm, inviting glow of a campfire, but rather a cold, unnatural light that sent shivers down my spine. My footsteps crunched loudly on the dry leaves beneath me, the only sound in the oppressive stillness of the night. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave whatever was out there alone, but something compelled me to keep moving forward. The light grew brighter, drawing me closer until I found myself standing at the edge of a small clearing. In the center of the clearing, surrounded by tall, ancient trees, was an old, rusted bus. It was almost identical to the one I had driven for years, but this one was abandoned, its windows shattered, and its once bright paint now faded and peeling. A small campfire burned in front of it, the flames dancing eerily in the still air. But there was no one around, no sign of life anywhere. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the bus, the sense of unease growing with each step. The light flickered again, this time from inside the bus, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward me. As I reached the bus, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The bus was covered in vines and moss, as if it had been sitting there for decades. But the strangest part was the driver's cap lying on the front seat. It was old and worn, with my name stitched on the inside, a cap I had lost years ago. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the fabric brittle and cold to the touch. This couldn't be real. I had never been here before, and yet everything about this place felt disturbingly familiar. The light inside the bus flickered again, and I knew I had to leave, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The silence around me deepened as I stood frozen at the entrance of the abandoned bus, the weight of the cap heavy in my hand. The light inside flickered once more, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed in the stillness. I knew I should turn back, leave this eerie place behind, but something kept pulling me forward. I took a hesitant step inside the bus, the floor creaking under my weight, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Inside, the bus was a haunting reflection of the one I had driven for years, but everything was distorted, twisted by time and neglect. The seats were torn and covered in dust, the windows cracked and clouded. A strange sense of déjà vu washed over me as I moved down the aisle, each step heavy with dread. The light, now softer and more subdued, seemed to originate from the very back of the bus, where a small, flickering lantern hung from the ceiling. I approached it slowly, every nerve in my body screaming for me to turn back, but I couldn't stop. The light called to me, drawing me deeper into the shadows. When I reached the back of the bus, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. Carved into the back of one of the seats was a name, my name. The letters were rough and jagged, as if they had been scratched into the fabric with something sharp. My hands shook as I traced the letters with my fingertips, the fear settling deep in my bones. This was no coincidence. Somehow, this place was connected to me, tied to my past in ways I couldn't understand. I felt a cold, creeping fear wrap around my heart as the shadows seemed to close in, the walls of the bus pressing down on me. The sound of faint laughter echoed through the empty bus, low and mocking, sending a jolt of terror through me. I spun around, but the bus was empty, just as it had been when I entered. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, as if it were coming from all around me. The shadows danced and twisted, and the light from the lantern flickered violently, casting the bus into near darkness. I stumbled back, dropping the cap as I turned to flee. But the bus felt endless, the exit further away with each step I took. Panic surged through me as the laughter echoed in my ears, the walls of the bus closing in, trapping me in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The darkness inside the bus was suffocating, the walls seeming to close in with every step I took. The mocking laughter echoed louder in my ears, twisting into a nightmarish chorus that made my skin crawl. My heart raced as I tried to find the exit, but the bus felt like a maze, the aisle stretching endlessly before me. The light from the lantern flickered one last time and then went out completely, plunging the bus into absolute darkness. I was trapped, blind and alone, with only the sound of that horrific laughter to keep me company. I stumbled through the pitch-black interior, my hands groping for anything familiar. The cold metal of the seats brushed against my fingers, and I gripped them tightly, using them to guide me forward. But no matter how far I went, the exit never came. My breath came in ragged gasps, fear tightening its grip on my chest. The laughter grew fainter, as if receding into the distance, but the terror it left behind was all-consuming. I was lost in a place that shouldn't exist, in a time that wasn't mine, with no way out. Just when I thought I would never escape, I stumbled into the clearing outside the bus, the cold night air hitting me like a shock. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by the dim light of dawn creeping over the horizon. I gasped for breath, my heart still pounding as I turned to look back at the bus. But what I saw made my blood run cold. The old, rusted bus that had been there moments before was gone, replaced by a pile of twisted, rusted metal barely recognizable as a vehicle. The campfire was out, and the clearing was silent, as if nothing had ever been there. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of the night's events crashing down on me. The driver's cap I had found was gone, lost in the confusion and terror. The only evidence that any of it had happened was the deep sense of unease that still clung to me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. When the campers found me later that morning, they said I looked as if I had seen a ghost. I didn't tell them what had really happened. I couldn't. The truth was too terrifying, too impossible to explain. I never returned to that campsite, and I quit my job as a bus driver shortly after, but the memory of that night still haunts me. The laughter echoing in my dreams, the shadows lurking just out of sight. I've tried to move on, to forget, but some things you can't run from. I don't know what that bus was, or why it seemed to know me, but I do know this. Whatever it wasn't finished with me. And sometimes, in the quietest moments of the night, I can still hear the faintest hint of laughter carried on the wind, reminding me that some nightmares never truly end.